Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to move on to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Rohan Pike. He is uniquely qualified to help us understand how illicit markets operate. Rohan is one of Australia's leading experts on illicit trade and organised criminal supply chains. A former law enforcement officer with extensive experience in illicit tobacco, Rohan has spent years analysing how criminal supply chains evolve, how they infiltrate legitimate markets, and the challenges facing regulators and enforcement agencies. Please welcome me in joining Rohan Pike.
That's you. Here we go. Thanks, Martin. Good afternoon. Who doesn't like a Benfold Grange? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Rohan Pike. I've been invited to provide some context around the illicit tobacco issue and how it might relate to the expanding illicit alcohol market. Whoops. I'd like to thank Martin Sterling and Michaela McKenzie for the invitation to speak today, and more generally thank the MGA for their advocacy in this space over several years, and particularly this year, and in fact particularly today, where Martin was on numerous news shows. Unless you've been living under a rock lately, you would have noticed Australia's tobacco control policies have now failed by any measure. Through excessive taxation and regulation, we've virtually prohibited legal cigarette sales and safer nicotine products. The results are there before you. Illicit tobacco at 80%, illicit vapes and pouches at over 95%. The shisha market's entirely illicit. Smoking rates are on the rise. Excise has decreased 75% in 6 years. The criminal market's valued at 7 to 8 billion. Small and large businesses are losing huge profits, threatening their viability. The crime gangs are becoming stronger and looking to expand and we'll explore whether that's alcohol today. And of course, we're only world leading in three things these days. It's the excise rate, the illicit rate, and tobacco-related violence. Illicit tobacco's slowly developed since the 1980s, when criminal groups would divert tobacco from the licensed growing regions of Myrtleford and Mareeba to backyards where it was shredded into smokable product known as chop-chop. This method of sale is still present through the smuggling of loose-leaf tobacco, adding to also some continued domestic cultivation, illegally obviously. Other loopholes in the tobacco control template that have been exploited include the diversion of duty-free cigarettes to the domestic market. Back in 2000, the excise rate was only 20 cents per stick, which sounds small compared to today's rate of $1.53. And yet criminals established elaborate schemes to avoid paying it. By 2015, the excise rate had risen to 50 cents per stick, and this encouraged criminals to bypass the payment of duty by, amongst other things, warehousing cigarettes that were purportedly then transshipped but actually diverted to the domestic market. The criminals were exploiting vulnerabilities in border controls, whereby the ABF rarely examine outgoing containers, relying instead on the honesty of exporters. Both the duty-free and bonded warehouse loopholes were closed off. Since 2010, the predominant form of illicit tobacco has been the smuggling of cigarettes and tobacco. In 2010, we saw the government embark on an ongoing effort to raise excise rates. They started with a 25% rise in addition to the regular rises pursuant to inflation. And now we're easily the most expensive legal tobacco in the world. This rise immediately triggered a rise in smuggling activity, as evidenced by multiple seizures from the Trident Task Force in 2012-13, and one of the officers from that task force is here today. Despite numerous warnings, the government continued to raise excise rates without thought for the likely consequences. The growth of the illicit tobacco market between 2010 and 2020 was largely in line with those excise rate rises. Since then, the growth has been exponential, as consumers, perhaps helped by the cost of living crisis, have flocked to the easily available, cheaper product. In April 2023, we saw the outbreak of violence, firstly in Victoria, but then across the country. This brought the size of the illicit market to the surface. This violence has come about as the increasing numbers of crime entities fight for market share. It should be noted that the violence is merely a symptom of the size of the criminal market. Due to the extensive efforts of Victoria Police, much of that violence has now been suppressed, but that's not an indicator that the illicit tobacco market itself has diminished. It's merely gone back to operating under the radar as it has for 30 or 40 years. Of note has been the rapid expansion of retail outlets selling illicit tobacco. This has proved an easy way for criminal syndicates to get their product to market, and this has occurred via threats and intimidation, but also out of economic necessity from other retailers. How have we allowed this to happen? Well, many of our laws are created by people with just no appreciation of the drivers of crime, criminal methodology or crime prevention. Sufficient guardrails are not factored into policies when they're made. Take, for example, the pink bat scheme, which was widely exploited, but on a larger scale, Social Security and the NDIS, where the leakage to fraud is in the billions. Our tobacco control policy is based on the fallacy that smokers will either quit or pay the high tax. These laws are passed on the assumption that people will automatically follow the rules. Often, when money is involved, they don't. Similarly, it's quite likely that the carve-out for distilleries in the alcohol market is also subject to widespread fraud and is being abused due to the lack of scrutiny. We create these schemes without stopping to consider whether they are vulnerable to criminals, and many are. Another example is the alcohol drawback scheme at the border, where previously imported and duty-paid product is then exported with the duty returned. But what if the outgoing shipment does not match the incoming? What if you export tyres instead of alcohol that you've paid millions in duty for? What are the chances of being caught if the ABF don't examine outgoing containers? It's pretty slim. The ABF have recently had 2 such investigations and that are each worth over $300 million. Criminals explore these loopholes in the border regime, so we should not be surprised that they've been attracted to these high-profit, low-risk crime types. They know that when demand remains strong and legal products become dramatically more expensive, they can offer a cheaper alternative, and they have. What we're talking about in a nutshell is prohibition-type policies, and those have never worked in history. So just to outline some of the similarities that I think we've seen between the alcohol and the tobacco markets. Criminals have been involved in the alcohol industry for some time. It's just that they've been flying under the radar. Excise rates for tobacco are easily the highest in the world. For alcohol, we're coming in third, behind Iceland and Norway, but still on the podium. Why do we make our citizens pay these ridiculous prices? That's for someone else to answer. But those policies are now coming home to roost. You'll hear the term unintended consequences in relation to alcohol and tobacco excise rates. Personally, I see that term as an excuse for poor policy. The reality is that the outcomes of these policies were highly predictable, and yet the government continues to back these failed policies in. The outbreak of violence has brought both issues to the surface and caused the excise rate to come into focus and illicit deniers to change their tune. Chris might tell you otherwise during the panel, but it's likely that the tobacco crooks are looking to expand, having now saturated that market. Also, the firebombings and extortion appear to be the threat of choice across the board, so that's a similarity. Both criminal types get their product to market very easily. And insurance, which was Martin raised before. It's not the issue that grabs everyone's attention publicly, but potentially it's one of the most important. Tobacco businesses have seen their premiums go through the roof if they can get insurance at all. As alcohol becomes more linked with violence, we're likely to see something similar in that market if we haven't already. Again, Chris might expand on this, but it appears the violence being primarily directed at parts of the industry that may not have been following all the rules in the first place. This also might be a factor in their reluctance to fully assist police when asked to do so. Legislation is playing catch-up. There is confusion as to which law enforcement agency is responsible for what part of the crime, allowing the criminal methodology to fall between the cracks. There's an unrealistic expectation on law enforcement to fix everything from the border right through to retail level. We have a tendency not to believe or to downplay research data, certainly if that data is industry funded. The recent National Drug Research figures stating 30% of bottle shops are selling illicit products should serve as a wake-up call. More research is needed, obviously, to fully understand the size and nature of the illicit alcohol market. And also when looking at the ATO illicit alcohol estimates, which are currently at 860 million and 7.5% of the market, remember that they recently admitted that they had no idea how to calculate the size of the illicit tobacco market, even though they've been doing so for about 20 years. Their previous estimates were unreliable, they said, and they won't be trying to estimate that going forward. So you can take their alcohol estimate with a grain of salt. Both crime types need to urgently review the drivers of the crime, particularly the excise, not just rely on law enforcement to mop up the mess that the policy has caused. To just touch on a couple of the differences that I think between the crime types is, and I haven't analysed the illicit alcohol as thoroughly as I have tobacco, so I'm interested in how industry people here actually define illicit alcohol. Would excessive production from local distilleries be included in that definition? Would alcohol subject to the drawback scam I mentioned before be considered illicit, even though they're genuine product? And if so, would anyone know whether that particular shipment had the duty paid or not? With tobacco, smokers are attracted to the cheaper price and know what they are buying is illicit and are happy to do so. I presume that most illicit alcohol buyers, particularly at nightclubs, don't know whether the product is genuine or not. Often, as opposed to the much cheaper tobacco products, prices do not vary that much from the regular retail price. The fraud is therefore committed upstream on the government and on the consumer at the retail level. Again, I suspect the likelihood of reputational damage has prevented some alcoholic retailers and wholesalers from assisting the police fully. While smoking might take a lifetime to cause cancer, drinking poisonous doses of methanol could kill people very quickly. The deaths of the Australian backpackers in Laos are still fresh in our minds, and a death or a critical illness here has the potential not only to destroy the business involved, but cause a loss of public confidence across the broader industry. As you'd be aware, the words big tobacco cause mass hysteria and paranoia in this country. One of the effects of that is that their concerns around illicit trade have never been taken seriously. Alcohol companies do not face quite the same hurdles in their advocacy, so there are opportunities for the message to be spread and heard. It does seem, however, that whereas tobacco companies are reasonably aligned on the issue of illicit, it seems alcohol companies and related associations are yet to use the power of their collective might to push their case. And I would encourage you to get on the same page and quickly. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Rohan. Really appreciate those insights, and your background in law enforcement is a really useful one here, because we are really trying to understand how are we going to be able to cope with the next crisis, and your experience is really, really valuable.